They thought thunder would come from the skies. It came wearing stars and stripes. 17 American generals, each with a different face, a different war, and one thing in common: the Nazis feared them. Not out of superstition, but calculation. These were the names circled in red, whispered in bunkers, tracked on maps like approaching storms. Some fought with tanks, others with shadows, all of them with precision. This isn't a tribute. It's a warning they failed to heed. Welcome to 17 American generals the Nazis feared the most. And no, they weren't all who you think. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button if you love history that doesn't flinch. We drop stories the textbooks won't touch. And while you're here, where are you watching from? What time is it on your end? Midnight in Missouri? 3 a.m. in Berlin? Drop it in the comments. We read every one. Now, let's meet the men who made the Reich nervous. 1. General of the Army, George S. Patton, Jr. The Nazis never feared ghosts until they met one in a helmet. George S. Patton, Jr., the man Berlin believed would lead the storm. Not Eisenhower, not Montgomery. Patton, the brass-knuckled reincarnation of cavalry warfare in a tank-slicked age, galloping over hedgerows with ancient rage and modern steel. German intelligence tracked his movements like one might track a rogue predator, unpredictably lethal, contemptuous of caution, and always hungry for ground. To the Abwehr, Patton wasn't just a general. He was the general. In their minds, the main Allied invasion would come under his command. Wherever he was, they assumed that's where the hammer would fall. And the Allies knew this. That's why in the months leading up to D-Day, Patton was given command of a phantom army, Fusag, a complete deception designed to convince the Germans he'd land at Pas-de-Calais. The Germans fell for it. Hook, line, and Panzer Division. But the real fear came later. After Normandy, when Patton finally let slip the dogs of mechanized war, his Third Army didn't advance, it lunged. Blitzkrieg in reverse. Town after town, bridge after bridge, over open fields and crumbling German morale. Field Marshal von Kluge wrote that Patton's advance across France was so fast as to seem unreal. German commanders issued frantic reports about the rapid collapse of the Western Front, always mentioning the same name. Not the Americans, not the Allies, just Patton. He didn't just outfight the Germans, he outthought them. He moved like he didn't care about terrain, weather, or probability, which made him terrifying. Because war, to Patton, was theology. Victory was inevitable. He'd seen it all before, maybe in a past life, maybe in a dream, or maybe in a blood-slicked mirror, just before rolling out across another fog-choked dawn. And while the Nazis were still scrambling to predict his next move, his tanks were already behind them. Eisenhower, meanwhile, was the opposite of Patton, which made him, somehow, even more dangerous. 2. General of the Army, Dwight D. Eisenhower. The Germans called him the organizer of victory, which was a polite way of admitting they had no idea how he kept the machine running. Dwight D. Eisenhower wasn't a battlefield ghost like Patton, nor a strategist with a signature move. He was something harder to pin down, and for the Nazis, more unnerving. He was steady, unshakable, as if the pressure didn't touch him, as if he already knew how it would end. Berlin monitored Eisenhower not because of what he did, but because of what he held together. In a coalition stitched from mistrust, egos, and a few too many languages, he kept the Allies aligned. The Germans knew how hard that was. They couldn't even get the Italians to pick up the phone, let alone coordinate simultaneous amphibious landings. But Ike? He made Churchill and de Gaulle sit at the same table, twice. That was sorcery. Intelligence reports from Fremde West fixated on Eisenhower's every appointment. When he was promoted to Supreme Commander, they knew the invasion was no longer theoretical. Berlin saw it for what it was, the beginning of the end. Not because of one army, but because one man could now direct all of them. The Nazis, despite their obsession with hierarchy, never figured out how to replicate what Eisenhower embodied: coalition command. They watched him command not with fear, but with dread. Because dread is what you feel when you realize the enemy isn't making flashy plays. They're just steadily closing the trap every day, without fail, with perfect coordination. And there's nothing you can do to stop it. Still, if Eisenhower broke Germany's back by alignment, Karl Spaatz did it by cutting the arteries. 2 generals in, and the patterns are already unsettling. Calm men with unstoppable momentum. If you're into this kind of slow-burn unraveling of forgotten fear, make sure you're subscribed. We go deep and we go often. And while we're at it, where are you watching from? What city? What hour? Is it late enough that the silence feels heavier? Let us know in the comments. We're building something here. 3. General Karl Tooey Spaatz. In war, fear doesn't always wear a helmet. Sometimes it wears headphones, sips black coffee, and signs off on flight paths that turn fuel into fire. Karl Tooey Spaatz was not the kind of general whose name thundered through infantry camps. But in Berlin, he was the slow suffocation they couldn't stop. The man who turned the German war machine into an engine that coughed, sputtered, and died in its own oil smoke. Spaatz had one goal: no fuel, no war, no grand charges, no dramatic speeches, just a quiet, merciless doctrine. Target the oil, drain the veins, end the Reich not with bullets, but with emptiness. By 1944, German generals were watching their tanks rust into statues. Luftwaffe pilots were grounded not by enemy fighters but by math. There simply wasn't enough fuel to take off. Armaments Minister Albert Speer would later confess that it wasn't the bombing of Berlin that broke Germany. It was Spaatz's oil plan. Cold, invisible, unrelenting. The Allies had bombers, and they had targets. But it was Spaatz who understood which targets mattered. He took a war obsessed with glory and stripped it to logistics. He hit Pulitz, Leuna, Bleckhammer, names unknown to most Americans but whispered like funeral bells in German bunkers. Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's top ace, said the targeting of synthetic fuel plants was the true turning point. By the time Spaatz was done, Germany wasn't just losing, it was stalled. And the most terrifying part? Spaatz didn't need to be there in person. He could end you from 30,000 feet. Of course, sometimes high-altitude destruction wasn't enough. Sometimes you had to send the fighter pilots off the leash, and Jimmy Doolittle did exactly that. 4. Lieutenant General James "Jimmy" Doolittle. James Doolittle wasn't a general the Nazis feared at first. At first, they barely knew who he was. Then he dropped bombs on Tokyo, and suddenly every German intel file had his name underlined twice in red ink. But that raid was just the trailer. His real war, his war of attrition in the skies over Germany, that's what made Berlin lose sleep. By 1944, Doolittle was commanding the 8th Air Force, the sharp end of America's strategic bombing campaign. But unlike the others, Doolittle didn't believe in playing fair. He looked at escort fighters, those sleek P-51 Mustangs shackled to bomber wings like sheepdogs, and gave them a new command: hunt. No more babysitting, no more passive protection. Let them roam. Let them seek out the Luftwaffe wherever it hid, on the ground, in the clouds, in their own airspace. What followed wasn't a campaign. It was a culling. Luftwaffe Commander Adolf Galland called it the beginning of the end. The sudden presence of American fighters deep inside German skies, picking off defenders like hawks circling a broken field, shattered morale and broke the back of the Reich's air defense. Ground crews watched helplessly as airfields were strafed. Pilots never made it off the tarmac. And once the skies belonged to Doolittle, the rest of the war started moving downhill, fast. The Germans weren't just afraid of his planes, they were afraid of the doctrine. Doolittle had turned air war into a free hunt, and nothing about that felt manageable. But for ground troops in Italy, fear came at night. No planes, no bombers, just whispers in the dark, and a name the Germans learned to dread: the Black Devils. 5. Major General Robert T. Frederick. If George Patton haunted German officers in their maps, Robert Frederick haunted them in their foxholes. He didn't command an army. He didn't lead squadrons. He led a myth. The 1st Special Service Force, better known by its German nickname, Die Schwarzen Teufel, the Black Devils. Frederick wasn't built for theater-wide movements. He was built for insertion, the kind of warfare that doesn't rely on numbers, but on dread. His unit, a joint Canadian-American commando force, operated like the shadows had learned to carry knives. Night after night, German soldiers in Italy's mountains would vanish, without a shot. Sometimes they'd find German sentries tied up, weapons gone, boots missing, a note pinned to their chest. The note just said, "The Black Devils were here." Captured German diaries during the Anzio campaign mention them with unease. First as rumors, then as facts. The 362nd Infantry Division filed reports asking for additional patrols, better lighting, reinforcements against an enemy that refused to behave like soldiers. Frederick had weaponized psychological warfare. He didn't want his unit to just win. He wanted them to unsettle. And it worked. His commandos slipped behind lines, destroyed supply routes, ambushed at night, melted into hillsides. They were a constant flickering threat in the peripheral vision of the Wehrmacht, never quite seen, never quite forgotten. By the time Frederick's men broke through to southern France, entire units were withdrawing at the mere rumor of their presence. But while Frederick worked in shadows, the next man brought the terror in broad daylight, at 400 miles per hour, with rockets strapped to his wings. 6. Major General Elwood Pete Quesada German tank crews had a name for it: Jabo Angst, fighter-bomber fear. But what made it worse wasn't the planes themselves. It was the sense that someone, somewhere was watching from inside your tank and had just called in the strike. That someone was Major General Elwood Pete Quesada. Quesada didn't invent close air support. He just perfected it in a way that made German generals start using phrases like impossible to maneuver. His innovation was simple: embed pilots with frontline units. Let the people calling in airstrikes see what they were striking. It wasn't theory anymore. It was precision. Brutally so. During the Normandy campaign, Quesada's Eing Tactical Air Command darkened the skies with Jabos, Jag bombers, low-flying, shrieking death machines that obliterated convoys, artillery, and anything that looked like it might contain fuel or hope. German commanders like Rommel and Klug both blamed the overwhelming presence of Allied air power, Quesada's air power, for the collapse of their ability to mount counterattacks. Imagine being a Panzer Division commander in 1944. You move during the day, you die. You hide at night, you run out of gas. You try to regroup, and someone in a hedgerow radios your location to a pilot circling overhead. The effect wasn't just tactical, it was paralyzing. Reports from the German front repeatedly cite aircraft, not infantry, as their most feared threat in the Normandy region. And it wasn't just the planes. It was the speed of the coordination. Quesada's teams cut the time from sighting to strike down to minutes. By the time you saw the pilot, he already had your coordinates. And when the skies fell silent and the tanks crept forward, another kind of terror came rumbling in, this time led by a man they called Lightning Joe. 7. Lieutenant General J. Lawton. Lightning Joe Collins. Speed kills, especially when it's wrapped in artillery and pointed straight at your command post. That was the gospel of J. Lawton Collins, nicknamed Lightning Joe, by soldiers who barely had time to keep up. To the German high command, He was less a man than a momentum, an advancing pressure front that couldn't be outrun, outgunned, or outflanked. As commander of Seventh Corps, Collins didn't just break through German lines, he broke openings in history. It was his corps that pierced the Bocage country after D-Day, tearing a path through St. Lo in Operation Cobra and initiating the chain reaction collapse of the German front in Normandy. German maps marked the location of Seventh Corps like a spreading infection, and everywhere it went, the Wehrmacht followed the same pattern: delay, retreat, surrender. But what made Collins so dangerous wasn't just speed. It was methodical speed, lightning that struck with a timetable. Unlike Patton's improvisational aggression, Collins was surgical. He believed in integrating infantry, armor, and artillery into a single punching mechanism, aimed with terrifying precision. German intelligence began referring to Seventh Corps as a shock formation, not in the figurative sense, but in the very literal kinetic sense of something designed to knock you off your feet and leave you stunned on the ground. And the worst part? He kept showing up. The breakout from Normandy, the drive across Belgium, the race to the Rhine, the Battle of the Bulge. If there was a breach to exploit or a flank to collapse, Lightning Joe's name was on the orders. But while Collins ripped open the front, another general was quietly closing the trap from below. From the vineyards of southern France, an invasion no one talks about nearly cut off the German 19th Army. And the man behind it? Alexander Patch. 8. Lieutenant General Alexander Patch. Some battles shout, others whisper. The invasion of southern France was the latter, a quiet storm, out of sync with the more cinematic carnage of Normandy. But to the Germans, it wasn't background noise. It was a second front with teeth. And the man orchestrating its advance up the Rhone Valley was Lieutenant General Alexander Patch, commander of the U.S. 7th Army and one of the most underestimated threats the Wehrmacht ever faced. Patch's style wasn't flamboyant. He didn't issue theatrical speeches or pose for camera reels. He advanced, relentlessly, and that, to the Germans, was more terrifying than any rhetoric. His forces moved through southern France with such speed and coordination that Berlin nearly missed the moment they were being outflanked. Operation Dragoon, the forgotten invasion, was supposed to be a sideshow. To the German 19th Army, it felt more like a trapdoor opening beneath their boots. German forces scrambled to withdraw north before Patch's mechanized columns closed the pocket. For a brief window, the Wehrmacht was staring at the possibility of encirclement, not from the famous names in the north, but from this soft-spoken general quietly folding France in half. Captured German orders from that period show a sudden panic. Entire formations were retasked just to avoid getting caught between Patch's advance and the oncoming Allied units from Normandy. The goal was no longer to win, just to escape, and the fear wasn't misplaced. Patch wasn't just fast, he was coordinated. He linked his forces with those coming from the north in a seamless join-up that shocked even Allied planners. The Germans, meanwhile, realized they had run out of real estate and time. But while Patch maneuvered like a surgeon, the next general led from the front like a man possessed. His name was Maurice Rose, and he never asked others to take a risk he wouldn't take himself. 9. Major General Maurice Rose. Maurice Rose didn't believe in staying behind the lines. He believed in leading from the front, literally. If his men were rolling into enemy territory, he was already on the hood of the first tank. If they were facing a counterattack, he was on the radio, not from HQ, but from the ditch next to theirs. To the Germans, Rose commanded more than just a division. He commanded inevitability. His unit, the 3rd Armored Division, Spearhead, was exactly that. The sharp end of the American advance across Western Europe. Under Rose, Spearhead became synonymous with speed, aggression, and firsts. First through the Siegfried Line, first into Cologne, first to make the German High Command pause and wonder, how did they get here so fast? But Rose's genius wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. His armor didn't just break through, it appeared. German commanders were repeatedly caught off guard by how far Rose's columns could push in a single day. And unlike some Allied formations that paused to consolidate gains, Rose kept pushing, even when it didn't seem possible, especially when it didn't seem wise. That relentlessness had a cost. Rose was so close to the front that, in March 1945, he was killed by a German tank commander, making him the highest-ranking U.S. general to die in combat in the European theater. His death shocked both sides. But to the Germans who had fought against him, it only confirmed what they already suspected. Rose didn't command from maps. He was the map. And just when they thought the nightmare of unrelenting American momentum might slow down, they saw the full weight of the 12th Army Group grinding toward them, under the iron hand of Omar Bradley. 10. General of the Army Omar Bradley. To the Germans, Omar Bradley was the opposite of flamboyant, which made him unusually terrifying. No ego, no theatrical outbursts, just calm, implacable destruction delivered with arithmetic precision. While others made headlines, Bradley built a machine. And that machine, the 12th Army Group, became the largest body of American soldiers ever assembled under one command. Bradley didn't posture. He orchestrated. His war wasn't about glory, it was about outcome. Quietly, methodically, and with a cold sense of proportion, he coordinated over 1 million men through France, into Belgium, across the Siegfried Line, and straight into the heart of the Reich. German commanders didn't respect him because he was flashy. They respected him because his formations never stopped coming. Field Marshal Walter Model, one of Hitler's most capable defensive minds, referred to the Bradley Group not in terms of strategy, but in terms of mass. The material weight of it. The relentlessness. It was a war of pressure, and Bradley applied it without letting his hands shake. His units didn't race. They rolled. And when they hit resistance, they didn't back off. They absorbed it, repositioned, and continued. The Battle of the Bulge. Bradley's forces reconfigured mid-fight, then punched through snow, fog, and chaos to counterattack. In the German view, Bradley's genius lay in patience. He didn't chase victories, he stacked them. A builder of bridges, literal and strategic. By the time German intelligence grasped the full scope of the 12th Army Group, it was too late. The war was already collapsing under its weight. But the strangest thing? Even the deception around Bradley required its own layer of misdirection. And that's where a seemingly forgotten general, Lesley J. McNair, enters the picture, as the face of an army that never even existed. 11. Lieutenant General Lesley J. McNair. Lesley J. McNair never led an invasion. He never commanded a battlefield breakthrough. And yet, for a time, the Germans believed he was one of the most dangerous men in Europe. Why? Because he was a ghost, part of the most successful illusion in modern military history, Operation Fortitude. When Patton was reassigned to real combat, someone needed to take over the illusion. Enter McNair, head of Army Ground Forces, now promoted, on paper, to command the fictitious 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG. Stationed in southeastern England, right across from Pas-de-Calais, McNair became the supposed leader of the real invasion force. Except none of it was real. To the Abwehr, this was gospel. McNair's presence was noted in Fremde West summaries. German scouts photographed fake tanks. Radio intercepts confirmed chatter. Even aerial reconnaissance saw divisions forming. And McNair's name tied it all together, providing just enough legitimacy to keep the entire German 15th Army pinned at Calais, waiting for a strike that never came. The irony is chilling. McNair, a man devoted to training troops and building doctrine, ended up playing a decisive role in D-Day by commanding an army of air, wire, and paper. Berlin watched his every fake move, clinging to the hope that Normandy was a feint. Even after Allied boots stormed Omaha Beach, the Germans still believed McNair was coming, with the real punch. But McNair's involvement wasn't without consequence. He was killed in France by friendly fire, a brutal footnote to a career largely lived behind the curtain. His final role? Convincing the enemy of a reality that didn't exist. And yet, while McNair's war was deception, the next general brought only blunt force, and his name would soon appear in the operational logs of collapsing German fronts. William H. Simpson. 12. Lieutenant General William H. Simpson. William H. Simpson didn't command headlines. He commanded results. By the time most people heard his name, the war was nearly over, and much of that quiet collapse had his fingerprints all over it. As the commander of the U.S. Ninth Army, Simpson's forces were the northern claw in the encirclement of the Ruhr, a campaign so vast it swallowed over 300,000 German troops in one bite. German generals noticed Simpson not because of flair, but because of frictionless integration. While Allied egos collided across headquarters tables, Simpson coordinated seamlessly with British Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group, an alliance Berlin believed impossible. And yet, there it was. American and British forces crossing the Rhine together, pinching the German industrial heartland shut like the jaws of a steel trap. Field Marshal Walter Model's reports from Army Group B describe a relentless pressure from Simpson's sector. It wasn't a dramatic thrust. It was sustained compression. The kind that doesn't make news until everything breaks at once. The Germans had counted on command disunity among the Allies. Instead, they found Simpson's forces moving with mechanical resolve, crossing rivers, seizing bridges, linking flanks with uncanny timing. In a war defined by personalities, Simpson was the anomaly, efficient, invisible, deadly. He didn't crave the spotlight. He was the spotlight, burning steadily over the final act of the Western Front. And just when Hitler thought he had one weak link left to exploit, one overstretched sector during a desperate gamble, it turned out that General was already preparing his trap. His name was Troy Middleton, and the Germans picked the wrong man to underestimate. 13. Major General Troy Middleton. Troy Middleton wasn't on Hitler's short list of feared commanders, and that was the problem. Because underestimating him gave the Germans a sliver of false hope, a tactical illusion that cost them their last real offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. As commander of 8 Corps, Middleton held the so-called quiet sector of the Ardennes in December 1944. To Berlin, this stretch of forested terrain was the weak link, the perfect spot to launch Wacht am Rhein, a final, desperate counteroffensive designed to split the Allied front. On paper, Middleton's forces were exhausted, understrength, and thinly spread. An easy break. In reality, they were the anvil on which Hitler's last gamble shattered. When the attack came, Middleton didn't panic. He adapted. He redirected his units to strategic choke points like St. Vith and Bastogne. He gave his subordinates full operational flexibility, and then he made a decision that would echo through history: hold Bastogne at all costs. That single order delayed the German advance long enough for Patton's Third Army to pivot north. The siege of Bastogne became legendary, but the broader picture often forgets that the defense was Middleton's design. His calm leadership allowed units like the 101st Airborne to lock down key road junctions that German armor had to pass through. They didn't, and the timetable collapsed. German panzer commanders later admitted the failure to capture Bastogne quickly was the death knell of the entire operation. Middleton, this soft-spoken Corps commander from Louisiana, had held the line against an entire field army. But while Middleton stood firm against the Nazi tide, another general was quietly threatening to outflank Germany's entire southern front. He didn't shout, he just moved forward, and his name was Jacob Devers. 14. Lieutenant General Jacob Devers. If the Western Front had a southern shadow, it moved in the shape of Jacob Devers. Quiet, overlooked, and often sidelined by Allied politics, Devers commanded the 6th Army Group, a massive force that advanced through Alsace, threatened the southern flank of the German defensive line, and came dangerously close to rewriting the endgame of the war. To Berlin, Devers represented a growing problem they were desperate to ignore. Their attention was locked on Patton in the center and Montgomery in the north. But in the Upper Rhine, Devers was setting the stage for a deep thrust into Bavaria, into the underbelly of Hitler's empire. The German general von Mellenthin would later reflect that if Devers had been allowed to push forward earlier, he could have reached the Danube before the main German lines could collapse southward. In other words, catastrophe. What made Devers a true threat was his autonomy. Unlike many commanders, he operated with a degree of independence from both Eisenhower and the British command structure, giving him the flexibility to exploit terrain and momentum. His forces successfully crossed the Rhine at Strasbourg before the more famous crossings to the north. But despite this, internal Allied disagreements slowed his advance, an opportunity the Germans didn't waste. Still, Berlin couldn't ignore him for long. As Allied pressure mounted, German planners were forced to redeploy critical divisions southward to shore up defenses along the Upper Rhine. The idea of Devers linking with Soviet forces from the southeast was a nightmare scenario they couldn't allow. And yet, even with his flanks stretching into the Alps, Devers was never reckless. Precision mattered, and for the next general, precision became fire, delivered at altitude, in formation with terrifying efficiency. His name was Curtis LeMay. 15. Major General Curtis LeMay. Curtis LeMay didn't deal in finesse. He dealt in results, delivered by bomb bays calibrated in tonnage and verified by smoldering grid squares. In the European theater, before he became the architect of firestorms in the Pacific, LeMay redefined what a bombing campaign could be. For the Germans, it was a redefinition that came with the sound of engines overhead and a growing realization that nowhere was safe. LeMay took charge of bombing divisions in Europe during the early phases of the Strategic Air War. His reputation spread fast, not because he talked big, but because his formations arrived in perfect combat boxes and left industrial cities looking like cracked porcelain. He ordered his bomber crews not to take evasive action during bombing runs, increasing accuracy at the cost of exposure. It was brutal math. And it worked. German civil defense reports began documenting a disturbing pattern: increased bombing precision, tighter formations, and a disturbing ability to hit key infrastructure despite heavy flak. The Luftwaffe couldn't keep up. LeMay was coordinating a machine of destruction that didn't need to improvise. It just executed, again and again. More alarming was his role in developing long-range escort protocols. Bombers no longer flew in isolated death spirals. They had fighter cover that could reach Berlin and back. German air defenses were overwhelmed not just tactically, but psychologically. Industrial planners began shifting operations underground. It didn't help. While others debated strategy, LeMay focused on repeatability, on making destruction as predictable as sunrise. But even at 30,000 feet, one threat haunted the German high command more than bombers: American paratroopers. And at the head of the airborne spear was a general who looked like he'd walked out of a trench and never left: Matthew Ridgway. 16. General Matthew Ridgway. The Germans understood paratroopers. That was the problem. They respected their own Fallschirmjäger as elite troops, disciplined, aggressive, psychologically dangerous. So when American airborne divisions began dropping from the sky in coordinated waves, Berlin didn't dismiss them as novelties. They studied the commanders. And the one who stood out again and again was Matthew Ridgway. Ridgway didn't look like a romantic hero. He looked like a man carved out of discipline. No pipe-smoking theatrics, no battlefield vanity, just hard eyes, jump boots, and a refusal to ask his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself. He jumped with them. He fought near them, and he expected them to hold ground that logic said should collapse. To German planners, Ridgway represented a new kind of threat: vertical envelopment. The idea that an American force could appear behind your lines, seize road junctions, bridges, and high ground before your reserves even understood what was happening. In Normandy, German reaction orders prioritized isolating airborne drop zones immediately, not because they were weak, but because if they weren't crushed early, they became immovable anchors for the rest of the invasion. Ridgway's 82nd Airborne didn't always land cleanly. Drops scattered. Units were fragmented. But what terrified German officers was how quickly chaos reorganized into resistance. Small groups linked up. Command emerged organically. Positions hardened. And every hour the airborne held on was another hour the invasion gained momentum. Later, commanding the 88th Airborne Corps, Ridgway became the embodiment of Allied rapid reaction. Wherever the line bent or broke, Normandy, the bulge beyond, his units were thrown in to stabilize, counterattack, or hold. German commanders learned to associate airborne insignia with stubborn, disciplined defense and sudden, sharp counterblows. Ridgway didn't just insert troops. He inserted certainty. The certainty that the Americans would be there before you expected them, and would stay longer than you planned for. And if Ridgway symbolized the airborne threat as a concept, the next general embodied it as a legend, one tied forever to a frozen crossroads called Bastogne. 17. Major General Maxwell Taylor. Maxwell Taylor commanded a division that the Germans learned to respect the hard way. The 101st Airborne didn't have tanks. It didn't have heavy artillery. What it had was refusal, and Taylor was the architect of that reputation long before Bastogne ever entered the history books. To German intelligence, the Screaming Eagles were already marked as a premier unit. They'd seen them in Normandy, dropping into chaos, regrouping under fire, locking down causeways that German counterattacks needed to reopen. Taylor emphasized discipline, initiative, and an almost irritating independence of thought. His officers were expected to operate without guidance. His soldiers were expected to keep fighting even when surrounded, confused, or cut off. By the time of the Ardennes offensive, Taylor was away temporarily, and Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe held direct command during the siege of Bastogne. But the division's behavior, the refusal to break, the calm under encirclement, the confidence to answer a surrender demand with a single dismissive word, was pure Taylor doctrine. The Germans weren't just facing a unit. They were facing an attitude that couldn't be negotiated with. Bastogne mattered because of roads, 7 of them. And the Germans needed everyone to keep their offensive moving. The 101st denied them all. German commanders later admitted that the failure to crack Bastogne quickly derailed the entire operation's timing. Every delay gave the Allies time to respond. Every hour the Eagles held was another nail in the plan's coffin. To the Wehrmacht, the lesson was brutal and clear. American airborne units weren't meant to win by maneuver. They were meant to block, to hold vital ground until the weight of Allied power arrived. And as the war ground toward its end, that realization settled in across the German high command. These generals didn't need to be everywhere at once. They only needed to appear where it hurt the most.